The night he came to our convent, I already knew he was there. I could feel it the way you feel a storm before the sky changes color. And before the sun rose that morning, the most feared assassin in Europe walked back out through our gates, not in chains, not wounded, not chased away by soldiers. He left because I gave him something no weapon on earth could have given him, something he hadn't felt in 20 years, and it destroyed every reason he had to complete his mission. I want you to stay with me until the end of this story, because by the time I finish, you'll understand exactly what weapon I used that night, and I promise you it was the last thing either of us expected. To understand why he came looking for me, I have to take you back to who I was before that night even began. I was 34 years old. I had lived inside the walls of our convent in the hills of northern Italy for 11 years. My days were simple, deliberate, and deeply quiet. Morning prayers before dawn, work in the kitchen garden, teaching the younger sisters how to preserve herbs and read Latin, sitting with elderly women from the village who had nowhere else to go. My life was the most ordinary thing you can imagine. I had never held a weapon. I had never raised my voice in anger toward another person. I believed completely and without doubt that cruelty was always born from pain and that patience was the most powerful force a human being could carry. I also had one habit that the other sisters sometimes teased me about. I watched people. I watched the way a person's eyes moved when they were hiding something. I watched how strangers held their shoulders, how they breathed, how they reached for a cup of water when they were afraid. I didn't know then that this quiet skill would one day be the only thing standing between me and a man who had never failed a mission in his entire professional life. The name I kept hearing that autumn was Voss. Nobody used a first name because nobody knew it. He was simply Voss, and the stories that reached even our remote corner of the world were enough to silence a room instantly. Nobles across 3 countries reportedly locked their doors at the mere rumor that Voss had been contracted. A Venetian diplomat had been found in his study, every door still bolted from the inside. A military general in Lyon had disappeared between one guard rotation and the next, leaving nothing behind except a single playing card on his empty chair. Soldiers whispered about him. Spies refused assignments near him. Even the families who hired him were reportedly terrified of him when the work was done. People said he had no conscience. People said he had no fear. People said he had never once left a witness alive. I told myself those were exaggerated stories, the kind desperate people tell to explain things they cannot understand. I told myself that as long as I stayed inside these walls and kept my faith and tended my garden, the world Voss operated in would never touch me. I was wrong. And it started with a young woman named Katerina. She arrived at our gates on a Tuesday evening in October, soaked through from a cold rain, carrying nothing except a small leather satchel pressed tight against her chest. She was maybe 19 years old, and her eyes carried the specific kind of terror that doesn't come from one bad moment, it comes from days of running. I brought her inside. I gave her warm broth and a dry place to sleep. I did not ask her too many questions that first night, because I understood that trust is something you earn slowly. By the 3rd day, she trusted me enough to show me what was inside that satchel. It was a letter, a single handwritten letter that named very powerful men connected to a papal financial arrangement in a scheme that had quietly funded the assassination of a regional governor 2 years earlier. The kind of letter that, in the wrong hands, could collapse reputations, end alliances, and drag hidden crimes into the open. In the right hands, it was protection. But Katerina had not yet figured out whose hands were the right ones, and someone very powerful had already sent Voss to make sure that letter never reached anyone at all. The first warning came 5 days after Katerina arrived. A trader passing through told one of our sisters that a well-dressed stranger had been asking questions in the village below about travelers who had recently sought shelter with us. A quiet alarm moved through me. Not panic, just that cold, clear feeling of a clock beginning to tick. I moved Katerina to a different room. I told the other sisters only what they needed to know, and I spent 3 nights barely sleeping, thinking through every angle I could imagine. If Voss came, I could not outrun him. I could not overpower him. I could not send for soldiers in time to matter. Every physical option I considered was useless. But somewhere in those 3 sleepless nights, a different kind of clarity arrived. I had spent 11 years studying people. I had sat with grieving mothers and dying men and young girls who had been broken by the world. I had learned that every human being, no matter how hardened, carries something they cannot fully bury, a wound, a question, a face they still see in the dark. And I made a decision that frightened me more than anything else I had ever done. I decided that if Voss came, I would not hide from him. I would sit across from him and I would find that thing. He came on a Friday night, 11 days after Katerina arrived. I heard him before I saw him. A soft sound in the corridor outside the chapel, barely a footstep, more like the absence of one. When I turned with my candle, he was simply there. Tall, lean, dressed plainly enough to disappear in any crowd. His face was unremarkable in almost every way except his eyes, which were extraordinarily still. The kind of stillness that doesn't come from peace. It comes from someone who has learned to feel nothing in order to do what he does. He told me very quietly that he knew Katerina was here. He told me he had no interest in harming anyone who was not his target. He told me that if I stepped aside, he would be gone before any of the other sisters woke. I looked at him for a long moment, and then I did something he clearly did not expect from a woman standing alone in a dark convent hallway at 2 in the morning. I invited him to sit down. I told him I had made tea and that he looked like a man who hadn't slept properly in quite some time. I said it calmly. I said it the same way I would say it to any exhausted stranger at my door. He stared at me, the way people stare when the situation they prepared for has suddenly become a completely different situation. He sat down. What followed was 2 hours of the most careful, precise conversation I have ever had in my life. I did not beg him. I did not preach at him. I asked him questions. I listened to his answers more carefully than I have listened to anything before or since. I watched his hands. I watched the tiny shifts in his breathing, and slowly, piece by piece, what I had suspected began to reveal itself. He was not a man without a conscience. He was a man who had sealed his conscience behind a wall of necessity a very long time ago, somewhere in his past, and he did not say this plainly, but I could feel the shape of it. He had made a choice that cost him something he never recovered from. A choice made under extreme pressure from powerful people. And every mission since then had been another layer of distance between himself and that original moment. I told him I thought he was a man who had convinced himself that he had no other identity left, that the work had consumed everything else until there was nothing he could imagine being instead. He went very quiet. Then I told him about the letter, not to protect Katerina strategically, but because he deserved to know the full truth of what he had been hired to suppress. The names in that letter included people who had used men exactly like Voss for years, men they considered disposable, and had discarded several of them when they became inconvenient. I told him I believed, based on what I had observed in our conversation, that he already suspected this, that somewhere underneath everything, he understood that the people who hired him had never seen him as anything other than a tool. Something moved behind his eyes, something old and deeply buried. He stood up without another word. He walked to the door. He paused there for just a moment with his hand on the frame, his back to me. And in a voice so quiet I almost missed it, he said, "I have never had a conversation like this one." Then he was gone. I sat in that chair for a very long time afterward, and I cried in a way I hadn't cried since I was a child, not from relief, though there was relief, but from the weight of what I had just witnessed, a man who had built an entire life around never being seen actually being seen, and choosing, for reasons I will never fully know, to carry that forward instead of completing what he came to do. Katerina reached a judge connected to a reformist movement 6 weeks later. The letter reached the right hands. Several men in those powerful positions were quietly removed from their roles over the following year, though nothing was ever announced publicly. History rarely announces its quiet corrections. I never heard the name Voss again. I do not know what path he chose after that night. I only know he chose a different one. What I kept from that night, what I carry with me still is this. I walked into that conversation more frightened than I have ever been. My hands were shaking under the table the entire time. I was not brave in the way people imagine bravery. I was terrified, and I moved forward anyway, because the alternative was surrendering to a moment I had the ability to shape differently. True strength is not the absence of fear. True strength is deciding, in the presence of fear, to reach for something more powerful than force. Patience, truth, the willingness to see another human being clearly, even when that human being has come to your door as a threat. I had no weapon that night. I had only what 11 years of quietly watching and listening and learning about people had given me, and somehow it was enough. The most dangerous thing I ever did in my life was sit across a table from a killer and refuse to see him as only that. And the most unexpected miracle I ever witnessed was watching him refuse to see himself that way either. I want to ask you something, genuinely. If you were alone, unarmed, and you knew someone that dangerous was coming, do you believe you could have faced that moment without a weapon? Not asking what you wish. I'm asking what you honestly believe about yourself. Tell me in the comments. I want to know. And if this story challenged the way you think about courage, what it actually looks like, where it actually comes from, please share it with someone who needs to hear it today, because the world talks a great deal about strength, and not nearly enough about the kind that doesn't make a sound.